Monday night. I left the hospital at 10 p.m. There were not many people around at that time, and most of us were exhausted. Naturally, I went straight to the pub. I began to hear what different friends and acquaintances were doing with the recovery effort. Peter H. is a wealthy man by all accounts, an ex-international business lawyer with a practice in Hong Kong, and he also apparently sold some huge website and retired to Phuket. He was once a mean centre-forward and remains a fiercely competitive quiz league player. His peer group are amongst my favourite people on the island. He also imports fine wines from Côte d'Rône as a hobby business. In short, there are many reasons to like him, and you should. His other passion is scuba diving. I didn't know this before the tsunami. That night in the pub, I asked someone about him, and they told me that he, along with many other of the island's professional divers, for the last 2 days, had been at the devastated Sofitel in Khao Lak retrieving bodies from the below-ground areas and the swimming pool. This is an horrific task, and the Sofitel had by all accounts suffered massive casualties, both amongst their staff and their guests. It struck me that night that here was a man with a beautiful life, almost perfect life, who was now, voluntarily, subjecting himself to horrible scenes that will stay with him forever. That man remains one of my heroes. He didn't have to do it. He could have got on a plane, as many did, and set off into the sunset, and returned when everything was back to normal, and I wouldn't have blamed him one bit. I also learned that Mike Hosking, whose wife I'd spoken to minutes after the wave hit, if you remember, was running supplies up to Khao Lak and retrieving bodies from the beach and taking them to the morgue. Mike, along with his business partner Nigel Peters, is also a property developer, and they are joint managing directors of Midas Promotions. It's one of Asia's leading concert promotion companies. Robbie Williams, Coldplay, Madonna, Michael Jackson, Oasis, I mean, you name it. They've promoted their concerts. Andy Street, another property developer, was using his fleet of vehicles to do the same task. Many of the expat wives were helping out at the island's premier private school, the then named Dulwich College, which was receiving lots of displaced people from Khao Lak. These ladies were the pampered set, by the way, more at home in a salon, a restaurant, or on the golf course than among the grieving and the sick. Most did a fantastic job. I told you that the humble amongst us don't have a patent on integrity, character, compassion, or bravery, didn't I? The main topic of the conversation of the night turned to the unreal feeling we all shared about the events that were happening around us. Howard is a former PricewaterhouseCoopers consultant and advisor to several governments. He also built a 3-story mock Tudor English pub and restaurant named the Green Man in 3.5 acres of landscape gardens, complete with a wine cellar, a cigar room, a Masonic hall, and a lovely grand piano. Howard remarked that it was entirely possible to have been 5 minutes from where dozens of people had been killed, and yet be completely unaware that anything had happened. He himself didn't know until 2 p.m. on the Sunday afternoon. That's his normal waking time. I remarked that in Pepper's Bar too, everything seemed so bloody normal. Like the Green Man, Pepper's was untouched by the wave due to being inland, and it was very busy. Busy with people who were exposing themselves to unimaginable horror all day long. Yet here we were, having a pint and chatting, as though everything was fine. And it was normal. That's the weird thing. The actual event was over, and the real world was seeping back into our lives. I began to realise that we would need the people who didn't do anything in the recovery in the coming months to be our stepping stones back into reality, and began to value their independence, their innocence, and their insistence on talking about normal things like football and the next night's pub quiz. This may sound like a contradiction of some of the things I said earlier, about the non-participants, and it is. Some things are just like that. We are complicated people, and contradictions are part and parcel of who we are. That night, the first bits of gallows humour crept in too. Do not judge us harshly for this. It's a coping strategy. Howard had been talking about the previous catastrophes he'd been caught up in, including a typhoon in Bangladesh which claimed 300,000 lives in a day in 1970. I said to him, note to self, do not live near Howard unless there has already been a disaster. His famous Basil Brush laugh must have echoed around the Green Man louder than any other time that night. I drank heavily. I did not get drunk. This concerned me a little, and then someone said it was the adrenaline inhibiting my getting pissed receptors, GPRs. There are many amateur scientists in the pub who agreed, and that was good enough for me, so I stopped worrying and ordered another. Tuesday morning. I woke up refreshed, considering the amount of Kilkenny I'd consumed the night before. Adrenaline is a strange thing indeed. When you need it, suddenly, one is aware of its effect. Say, in a near crash where you have to brake suddenly, it causes the heart to pump and the legs to shake. Time slowing down, tunnel vision, and amazing physical strength have all been attributed to it coursing through our veins. The adrenaline we were all wired on in that first week did not feel like that at all. It was imperceptible, but I was aware of other effects, not just my newly acquired immunity to the effects of alcohol. I was thinking very clearly. I was giving advice concisely and accurately. There was almost an intuitive part of my brain that knew the words that people needed to hear when they came to me. I was able to prioritize my time and the team's efforts very efficiently. In those few first days, I'd been able to give comfort to so many people. I'm not saying that we got everything right, but I could tell from the reactions of the people we were supporting that they had definitely gotten something valuable out of seeking our support. By the second day, we had a small group of victims who used our resources to the exclusion of all others. This day, however, would be unlike any other. Our small group of people was to grow exponentially, and I made at least one huge mistake. I watched the TV news, switched over to Thai news, and asked Lisa to translate the bits I couldn't understand. Then, as was becoming a pattern, we went to the Gazette website, and CNN were in trouble. Laguna Phuket had issued a press statement denying CNN's reports, broadcast globally, that the resort was totally destroyed in the Boxing Day tsunami. Laguna Phuket Events and Press Relations Manager Michelle Payette told the Gazette, a glance through some of the other major news portals revealed the following headlines. 392 confirmed dead, more than 3,000 injured by tidal waves in Thailand. 300 believed dead on Thailand's Phi Phi Islands. Australia says 5 nationals are among the missing and offers 10 million Australian dollars in quake aid. The grandson of the Thai king was among those missing after the deadly tidal waves. No warning system in place for tsunami-hit countries. That was from the USGS. Death toll passes 11,000 as a huge earthquake triggers destruction across Asia. The saddest headline for anyone who lived in Phuket, though, was also on the Gazette website a few hours later. Naihan loses a great friend. Phuket, and the Rawai community in particular, lost one of its most dedicated and lovely people to the Boxing Day tsunami, Leonie Cousins, wife of Tim and friend to many. She moved to Phuket from New Zealand some 11 years ago and quickly helped establish the Phuket Animal Welfare Society, commonly known as PAWS, which, along with other organisations, had helped care for, sterilise and therefore reduce Phuket's stray dog population. Leonie worked with her Thai helpers selflessly, tirelessly, and very often at her own expense, to help the strays in the south of the island and around Nai Han Beach in particular. Leonie and Tim had worked hard in recent years, creating a beach paradise at Yanui Beach near Lemprom Thep. It was there that she went to respond to a call for help from some guests staying there. It appears she was swept away by the strongest wave that demolished everything on and around the small popular beach. Leonie, like so many casualties that day, had no chance of escape. She was deeply missed, and her fellow dog carers endeavoured to continue her excellent work. Many people I've spoken to since have remarked that this was a moment that really brought it home to them. This wasn't a stranger. This was a well-liked and respected member of our own little world. I didn't know Leonie very well, but I knew loads of people who did, and they were devastated. There were hundreds at her funeral, and the island was a poorer place for her passing. I arrived at the hospital at 8 a.m, and my parking spot was free, which was spooky. The pictures on the boards of the missing were increasing, and people had resorted to sticking them up on the walls too. There was a group of young Israelis staring at the board. They told me a group of their friends had gone to PP scuba diving and were now missing. They were very together. They had very professional-looking missing posters and had organised their searching party incredibly well. They had one central phone number and location for contacting them, and one of their team stayed at that one place all the time. The others had split up over the various likely locations. It was almost like a military operation, and maybe it was. Israel has conscripted military service, and youngsters who have just finished their stint are a well-known feature of the backpacker routes of the world. Unexpectedly, they impacted on me very deeply. Their hope was tangible, and they put me back in a place totally out of context. I was back in Calcutta, living a life without consequences or worries, a simpler, happier time. In Phuket, I had to make a book, all the time. It put an edge on me that wasn't there before, and I hated it. I listened intently as they told me their story about their strategy, and I had nothing to offer them in terms of resources. They'd done everything already. I was infected by their passion and enthusiasm, though, and I gave them a pep talk about not giving up, to keep the hope alive, but also to prepare for the worst. This group of people, so young and so innocent, with the world at their feet, had a determination that impressed me immensely, and, in private, it made me cry. I hugged them one at a time. It was as if by telling their story and strategy to me, they were looking for approval that they were doing enough, doing the right thing, doing what should be done, and doing everything. As they got ready to leave, I told them that were I one of their missing friends, I would be enormously proud of what they were doing, and that I couldn't have asked for more. These words came from nowhere, but they were exactly what they and many other people wanted to hear from me in the coming days. In the BBC documentary, I'd taken a break, and Frank just asked me a couple of questions. And I said to him, a lot of the people coming here today are looking for me to give them hope, and I think I should. Some words that stay with me. Hope is the currency of a disaster. It's what we're there to give out. It's what we're there to spend. Hope based on reality. That last part of that sentence is really important, because even though this was 20 years ago, the internet was churning out its usual rumours, memes, stories, none of which had been fact-checked. or even thought about very much before being posted. It's a problem. It's a problem that a lot of our work in the next few days was aimed at solving. We had somebody in every location where rumours had been heard from. In the temples in Khao and the hospitals in Pangar and the police station. We had people in every location on the end of a phone, and we could call ahead with a rumour and have them check it out. My phone went off and it was Nitya, the researcher from the BBC documentary crew. I'd completely forgotten about them, and I had to improvise as the lovely Nitya chatted away about the things we talked about yesterday. I was busking, but I got away with it. I genuinely had no recollection of the conversation from the previous day. They said they'd arrive at the hospital within the next 30 minutes. I walked to our area in the hall and was pleased to see that the same team had turned up again, plus some others. The IT desk had swelled and had a good internet connection, and that Peter had left me a note to say he was buying everyone pizza for lunch, and to call him when we needed it. Result. The previous day, a call had gone out for clothing and water to be sent to Khao Lak, and the huge Christmas tree outside the hall was steadily being obscured by piles and piles of clothing. I assembled the team for our first ever briefing. I explained that the BBC crew who had just arrived wanted to film the work we were doing. I introduced their producer, Frank Smith, who explained to everyone that they would in no way be intrusive, and if we asked them to stop filming, they would. He also told us that the programme they were filming for had a reputation for telling events in people's own words, and that there was no angle other than the truth. We took a vote and agreed to allow them access on those terms. And as long as we could commandeer the laptop that Frank was carrying. He agreed immediately. A few minutes after that, a well-dressed, well-spoken, attractive woman appeared at my desk. She explained breathlessly that she was the doctor from the British Embassy. I began to explain what we were doing, but she ignored me and looked at a woman who stood behind me, who actually wasn't a volunteer but was better dressed. To this day, I have no idea who that woman was. The doctor then told her that we should be giving everyone sweet drinks and plenty of them, and with that, she was gone. We all shrugged our shoulders and carried on with what we were doing. Dr. Dorothy and I were to meet again later in the week. I went outside by the Christmas tree, which was looking more and more incongruous by the minute. Near the tree, there was the coffee station, and you could smoke there. And for the first time in a week, I saw Alan Cook. I've mentioned Alan before. He's one of the legends of the island. He's one of the world's leading experts in underwater concrete. A subject he freely accepts is not a conversation starter, middler, or even ender. He became a deep-sea diver when it was more about hope than technology, and is also a former member of the Special Boat Service. In his nomadic life, he was the founder of Dubai Cricket Club, the Phuket chapter of the Hash House Harriers, a drinking club with a running problem, where his nickname or hash name was Dubai. He was living in Kuwait when the Iraqis invaded and led a group of expats over the desert to freedom into Saudi Arabia. Since coming to Phuket, he'd also started the Phuket British Business Association, founded a very successful furniture business, Island Furniture, and made several attempts to get a cricket club built here. He did eventually succeed many years later. He was also the British Honorary Consul. Lucky old Britain. He is one of life's natural leaders, a real man's man who commands respect wherever he goes and can organise manpower and resources brilliantly. He is one of the most cherished members of our community, even though he's quite spiky. His forthright manner, occasional arrogance, and utter self-confidence can drive you nuts in the most endearing way. He would be deeply embarrassed to hear anyone talk about him like this, as, rather like a lot of men of his generation, he's more than a little awkward with emotions, feelings, and the articulation thereof. Alan always gets to know any new British person on the island, and if he takes a liking to you, he takes you under his wing. He makes your introduction to life and business here smooth by introducing you to the right people and generally helping whenever he can. I've been under his wing in the past, and it's a nice place to be. He's also known to call in these favours when he needs to, and this week I think he'd called them all in. Therefore, within hours of the wave hitting, he'd assembled at his HQ, the Courtyard, a shopping mall he built near the centre of the island, and he'd put together a group of the most capable and knowledgeable men and women that Phuket's British community had to offer, and they'd got cracking. By the first night, they'd established that there needed to be a presence at the airport, so had set up a desk there to welcome those who were arriving to look for their missing and guide them to the right places. They did this for all nationalities, not just the Brits. They had a fleet of cars and drivers to take people to those destinations too. They were issuing a variety of useful advisories via email to assist other volunteers, and became a reference point for nearly everyone who needed to check out a rumour. If they didn't know the information you needed, they would get it to you and always called you back. I'm not glorifying their achievements because they're my countrymen. I'm merely describing what they did. No other country had it together so quickly, not even the Germans, who were the betting man's choice to be any good at this stuff. We heard rumours that the Germans had got helicopters and troops in on the first day, which inspired one commentator in the pub to say, well, they're quite good at that. It's called a blitzkrieg. It got a big laugh, but we were all so pumped full of adrenaline that even a gag as weak as this could, and often did, reduce everyone to giggles verging on the manic. I approached Alan and he looked surprised to see me. Then he remembered that I used to be a nurse. I told him that if he had any families who needed emotional support or someone to accompany them to the morgues or other sites, to give me a call. He acknowledged this. We didn't have time to talk because he was escorting the British ambassador on a tour of the hospitals. I became too busy to wait around for an introduction. Although a chap who seemed to be high up in the entourage came over and said something to me along the lines of, "Keep up the good work." It felt nice. I sat down at my desk, and there was a chap to the left of me also sat down. His hair was all over the place, and he clearly hadn't shaven for a few days. He had a look like many we saw, like a refugee. In an undistinguishable German accent, I guessed it was Swiss. He told me with very measured and calm tones what had happened to him. "I'm missing a small boy." I asked from where, and he answered, "From Phi Island. It's a huge loss for us, but we saved 2 boys, so we feel privileged, because we could have all been wiped out, the whole family. Me and my eldest boys were, unbelievably, swept across the arm of the peninsula." I wanted to say to him, "No, you are not privileged. Your child is missing and probably dead." But I didn't. I was humbled at the generosity of spirit this man showed in his darkest hour. He was able to consider the fate of others and declare himself fortunate. I remember this and his complete resolve and calmness often. He asked if we could arrange to distribute the missing posters he'd already made, and I said we would. We just set up a team to do exactly this job. He was waiting on the processing of some photos of his boy that were taken on the same day as the wave hit. And in these pictures, he was wearing the same clothes as when he was swept away. By this, it was apparent that he'd already resigned himself to the sad fact that this was going to be a search for a body. He knew that the clothing might be useful for identification. I told him to bring those pictures when he had them, and we would make new posters and distribute those too. He was so grateful. I walked from behind the desk and put my arms around him. I was lost for words in the presence of his calmness and acceptance. It was the only way I could think of to show him that I had really heard what he'd just told me. That I acknowledged the gravity of his loss, that I cared, and I admired him for the manner in which he was dealing with it. I know that he felt all of that in that embrace. This exchange was shown in the BBC documentary, and it's a powerful moment. I walked off to make the necessary preparations to distribute his missing poster. I hadn't looked at it yet, and when I did, it crushed me. The child was 8 months old. I made for the toilet, and I had my first real sob. When I got my act together and returned to the hall, many of the volunteers had questions for me, and I dealt with each of them in turn. I was aware that behind them, waiting patiently, was a guy who'd clearly been caught up in the wave. He looked in a terrible state. His open shirt revealed cuts and abrasions all over his chest, which was heavily bandaged. He approached me and held out his hand. My name is Anders, and I lost my 2-year-old son Ragnar in Khao Lak. He was wearing blue swim bands with a picture of a dolphin on them. His last words to me were, "Papa, I'm scared." As he finished the sentence, his eyes welled up, as did mine. I stood up and I touched his shoulder and invited him to sit down. He told me since that that was the most significant gesture anyone had made to him in those first few days of his search. The fact that I touched him and asked him to sit down was significant to him at that moment. He has told me since that this is when he knew someone was actually listening. Healthcare professionals, take note, please. It's not always our knowledge that is significant. It's our common humanity and sincerity. I asked him if he'd like a drink and organised the coffee to be brought to him. I asked him to tell me more, and he elaborated. When the ocean reached us on the second floor in our bungalow on the beach, the whole house disintegrated all around us, and we were flushed out through the stone walls. I was holding Ragnar in my arms, and we were thrown inland, travelling 8 or 10 metres above ground, in a speed of about 40 kilometres an hour. Ragnar was scared and shouted, "Daddy, Daddy, help, help." After a couple of 100 metres, Ragnar was torn out of my arms and he drifted away from me, floating on his blue swim bands. This is when he said, "Daddy, I'm scared." There was a pregnant pause I didn't want to interrupt. He took a deep breath, looked to the sky, swallowed and continued. I was pinned against a tree, or the branches of a tree. There were 2 other Scandinavian children at my feet, and I couldn't move to help them. I could not move. The power of the water and debris had pinned me to the tree. The water was rising and rising, and eventually it rose above their heads. And they drowned. I could see it happening. The water continued to rise, and eventually it rose above my head, and I prepared to die. I took 3 breaths of water, and then out of nowhere, a hand reached down and pulled me clean out of the water and onto a boat. It seemed that guy had superhuman strength. I don't know how he did it. Anders was then taken to Takwapar Hospital and treated for crushed ribs and cuts and bruises. He could not wait to get out of there and begin his search for Ragnar and his wife Lisa, who was also missing. Lisa had been swept inland about 3 kilometres to where a police boat, that is now a memorial, was washed ashore and grounded in a lagoon. She was evacuated to Pangar Hospital, 2 or 3 hours south. Via various means, they discovered each other's location and independently set off to each other's location. They thought that they must have actually passed each other on the road at one point. Eventually, they were reunited later that day, but Ragnar was still missing.